Unfiltered, uncensored, and unapologetic. This is the Retail Warzone podcast.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a very rare off-schedule Retail Warzone. I go ahead and give a shout out to Irish Connection, who kind of did the footwork on making this happen. He had messaged me looking to get a hold of somebody, in the academic field to talk about some of the topics that we cover. And, him being the Warzone MVP, he made good on that promise. So this evening we have joining us Nick Colsch. He is currently director for the Wyoming Center for Business and Economic Analysis. So having said that, we're going to talk about minimum wage. I know that's a topic that a lot of us kind of flirt around with a good bit on here. So having said that, Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into what you're doing, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Nick Colsch. I'm an instructor of economics and public policy at Laramie County Community College. I studied economics, accounting, and marketing at the University of Iowa for my undergrad. I got a master's in economics at Western Illinois University, and then just kind of bounced around the Midwest before accepting a job out here in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So for the Center for Business and Economic Analysis, I write economic reports and commercial property reports for Laramie County, which is where Cheyenne, the capital, is. And I just teach a lot of economics courses. So
nice.
That's the other half of my job. Yep.
So we're just gonna roll into this. So Irish, I know you're prepared. So start us off. What you got?
Well, somewhat. I just want to say that it's an appropriate topic, obviously, at the moment because of everything that we see in the news about labor shortage and this, that, and the other, but also from an academic point of view, which is tonight's kind of theme. This month, the Nobel Prize for Economics was handed out to people who were talking about the minimum wage and how raising the minimum wage does not lead to job losses. And that came from David Card from Berkeley, Joshua, I think it's Anghurst from MIT, and another individual from Stanford. So these are people who actually know what they're talking about. So just to set the tone, we're talking about something that's both in topic and from an academic point of view relevant to something as prestigious as the Nobel Prize. So that's just one thing. But I would just like to ask Nick, first of all, from a historic point of view, the minimum wage, why was it initiated?
So the minimum wage became an issue because of labor disputes that became bloody, really. So a lot of labor laws started in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We started having child labor laws. We started establishing standard work weeks, which were initially 6 days a week and now are 5 days a week. And then we had to start establishing minimum wages because we had people who could work, but not necessarily afford a place to live. And so we wrote the Fair Labor Standards Act, I want to say in 1935. That's established the first minimum wage. Which is just the minimum requirement that you have to pay someone to go and actually work for you.
So as we were discussing, before the stream, tell us a little bit about the two states that you know of that have the really, really pitiful low state minimum wage.
Yeah. So there are two states that actually pay below the federal minimum wage. One is Georgia, where they pay $5.15, and the other is Wyoming, where they also pay $5.15 an hour, which would be the minimum wage back before it moved to $7.25 in 2009. So it's been at least 12 years old. But how it works is not every business is subject to the federal minimum wage. It doesn't affect businesses that earn less than $500,000 and don't engage in interstate commerce. So big corporations, your Amazons, your Walmarts, they have to adhere to the federal minimum wage. but like a small farm or ranch that doesn't bring in over $500,000 in revenue does not. And so that's how states can get away without paying the federal minimum wage.
Real quick, before we get into this list of stuff Irish has, the discussion, we talk a little bit about the goodwill thing.
Yeah. So there are establishments that hire people who are mentally and physically disabled. And so if those employees were deemed essentially it's hard to explain. Basically, if their productivity wouldn't match a typical worker's and they couldn't be hired anywhere else, companies can take advantage of that and be allowed to pay a wage lower than the minimum wage. So companies like Goodwill have taken advantage of this system where they hire people who are mentally disabled and then pay them a wage below the federal minimum wage. That
is just awful. I mean, terrible.
Yeah.
Wow. All right, Irish, what you got?
Well, just to ask something on is that exclusive to thrift stores, or is it possible for the likes of Walmart to also exploit that?
It would be possible for other firms to exploit it. Thrift stores are just kind of known for being ones that hire those mentally and physically disabled folks. Yep. Okay,
just you're an academic. Okay, so from an academic point of view, does it frustrate you that the vast majority of papers and research out there that talk about the minimum wage don't really do it from the employee's perspective?
Yeah, it's kind of tough because a lot of it is kind of macro or aggregated data. So it's the employers that are going to put out the data on the number of people they hire, right? So like a Card and Crew paper, for example, when they raised the minimum wage, I believe it was in New Jersey, and they talked about the number of jobs in retail and other sectors between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They were looking at kind of like a border analysis because I believe New Jersey raised their minimum wage and Pennsylvania didn't. And you didn't see this big shift of jobs crossing the border, right? Because essentially it's just traveling to a different state to work. So yeah, it's where the data comes from. So it's looking at how employers are keeping their employees on and not necessarily the standard of living from an employee's perspective.
From an academic standpoint, what do you think the holdup has actually been with the minimum wage not moving, in 12 years?
Sure. So there is this big argument that if the minimum wage goes up, it'll cause higher inflation, it'll cause job losses, because people look at it from a very strict, like, supply and demand type model. They don't take into account that prices inflate even when the minimum wage doesn't inflate. They don't take into account that other costs don't necessarily move when the minimum wage changes. They don't take into account the fact that people on the low end of the income spectrum spend a larger proportion of their income on goods and services. And so when you raise the minimum wage for people at the very bottom, they're actually going out and spending that money, recirculating it in the economy. And so there's this demand shift that people are not accounting for. You're strictly looking at inflation. Yeah.
We covered that a while back. I covered cost plus inflation. And, that's one of the things that a lot of these businesses try to do, and they try to use that as an excuse. But the reality of it, from, working in the business as long as I have, is it seems to me that it comes down to the corporations and the sellers of goods and services refuse to take any kind of hit on their profit margins. So the wages could go up, and they could take like a 5% hit overall, on an item, so to speak. And, it just seems like the argument for minimum wage just becomes, how can we validate moving the goalpost, for profit as the minimum wage possibly increases?
Yeah, so we kind of saw this with Amazon like last year or 2 years ago, because you would see stories on like the John Oliver program about the way that Amazon warehouse employees are treated. And then you hear about like what they're being paid for arguably the most profitable company in America. I mean, it's like huge, right? Jeff Bezos is worth like $200 billion. And so, they kept arguing Amazon should pay their employees better. So Bezos reacts, says, hey, we're going to pay all of our employees $15 an hour, and gets good PR out of it after people have like nagged him for months to do it. So if you can put it into a PR perspective, they're going to do that instead, right? Like, we pay our employees better, come shop with us.
Yep. Your turn, Irish.
Okay. Now, one of the arguments, as you just mentioned there, against raising the minimum wage, they always throw inflation at you. Now, what I would argue there is that for lower wage workers across the board, including in retail and service workers, from an academic point of view, their rate of inflation for cost of living is actually disproportionately higher than the average wage. So there are different rates of inflation, in other words. So like, the cost of gas, cost of food, everything else. So, their proportion of what they pay out of their wages in rent, in food, and gas is actually disproportionate. They have a much higher inflation rate than the average as that is reported.
Yeah, so we're kind of talking about two different things. Like the inflation rate for the country, like everybody kind of faces that. But if you look at things like rent is really the big issue here.
Big time.
The minimum wage has not kept up with the inflation of rent. Mm-hmm. If you look at a map of the minimum wage needed to afford like a 2-bedroom apartment in every state, the minimum state, which I think is like Arkansas, one of the lowest cost of living states in the entire U.S., you would need a wage of like $14.50 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Like, we're not talking buying a house. We're talking kind of the bare standard of living. And so the fact that, places like Arkansas still have a $7.25 minimum wage, it's half of what it's needed to live there. There's that disconnect.
Yeah. And
until we tie the minimum wage to rents, you're just not going to see that living wage show up.
Right. And I had done some research. All right. So obviously the minimum wage hasn't changed since 2009, but since 2009, the median rent has went up 35%.
Yeah. Yep. It's brutal. I mean, I even showed my students the other day, my old apartment that I lived in, which is just kind of a shitty little 1-bedroom apartment. Had carpeted bathroom, carpeted kitchen, carpeted everything because it was built in the 70s. And it flooded like 4 times when I lived there because it's a basement level apartment. Went from $680 a month in rent when I left there a year ago to $750 a month on the market as of yesterday.
Wow.
Like, just stupid, right? Like,
yeah,
this is not a good place to live. And they raised the monthly rent by $70.
Do you think the pandemic and the amount of potential evictions come into play with some of these astronomical rate increases in rentals just to try to cover their losses?
It's fascinating, right? Because I don't know that there were a lot of landlord rent assistance programs built into the CARES Act. Right, you just heard about people receiving expanded unemployment benefits. Yeah, if that eviction moratorium goes away, and it very well could, or has in some places, you could see a lot of people out on the streets or moving to a lot cheaper places because remote work is going to become much more expanded in the U.S., I believe.
So in your research and everything that you've learned, I know one of the big things that I've focused on a lot as far as wages go is, up until about 1970, productivity and wages were kind of, on par with each other. And then and then 1970, the wheels came off the wagon and productivity, sky high. and the wages stayed flat. Do you attribute that to more or less, for lack of a better term, corporate greed?
So that is a huge part of it, right? It's the minimum. The wages for the average worker, I think, went up like 18%, right, in the last 4 years, and productivity went up 100%, right? So productivity doubled, and wages didn't match it, not even close, right? Part of that is definitely corporate greed. If you look at ratios like CEO salaries compared to their average workers, right, it's that ratio has increased from like 35-1 to over 100-1. Like it's wild how much executives get paid for compared to the people actually doing the work, you know?
Absolutely. Irish, what you got?
Well, slight change of topic there, but I would be interested to know, Nick, what your opinion is on the kind of cultural aspect of minimum wage. In other words, how minimum wage is perceived now versus maybe, say, 30 years ago. Because I, for example, like most people, started off a minimum wage, and the perception was at the time that, you know, you're earning minimum wage because you need to learn, you need to upskill, blah 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 blah. Now, like, that doesn't hold any water for me anymore, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Right. That is the argument the kind of layman makes, right? A person who doesn't study economics, doesn't study labor, is just going to say, well, it's designed for teenagers. It's designed for low-skilled workers.
Correct.
People need to learn, and then they'll move their way up and out of it. And like, the fact is, if the minimum wage were designed just for teenagers, and teenagers are the only ones who should accept those jobs, then why are fast food restaurants and retail stores still open during school hours? I mean, where are the teenagers to go and actually work those jobs? Like,
damn good
that
point.
Doesn't hold water for them.
Correct. And why is the median age of a fast food worker in their probably 30s? You know?
Yeah. So I think part of it is barriers to education, financial barriers to education. Typically, you can retrain in a trade skill, or you go and get a degree. But states on the whole have kind of reduced their state contribution to public institutions. So places like the University of Iowa and Western Illinois, where I went to school, now receive less funding per student than they typically did 30, 40 years ago. So the cost of going to college is much higher for people in my generation than, say, my dad's generation. So going back and retraining becomes very financially costly. People have families, and so they need to have money to go and support their kids, and maybe spouses that don't work. And so they cannot take time away from it, from being full-time employees, to go back and retrain. And so you just have these financial barriers set in place, and part of it's personal choice, like choosing to have kids. And part of it is personal choice and not going to college right away out of high school. But the financial barrier to go to school is really the big thing that kind of keeps people stuck, if that makes sense.
So when you're teaching, what kind of feedback and like questions do you get, you know, from, you know, obviously, you know, from my standpoint, a younger generation on topics like the minimum wage and things like that?
Yeah. So I did a video interview for CGTN. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Living on Minimum Wage. And I'll show it to my students, and we'll talk about, you know, what should the minimum wage be? Should it be a living wage, like is suggested by data, where it's like 3 to 4 times whatever the average rent is in your area? Should it still be sitting at $7.25? Should there be a minimum wage? And so we get into discussions about kind of where it should land, right? And so students who are out there working for the minimum wage obviously argue, yeah, it should be a lot higher, right? Like, I need to pay all my bills and I'm falling behind on certain things. And like, if their car blows up, they just don't have the money to make a repair. And it becomes a real problem for them. Other students will argue that, you know, these are people without skills. And so until they learn them, they should be paid kind of like these low training wages. They should be able to work their way out of it. And in a perfect world, the hardest working people should be paid like millionaires. But, the fact is, teachers and farmers typically don't get paid all that well.
Right. Now, I would also think, too, that a lot of that opinion is probably something they were raised with.
Oh, absolutely. Right. It's a meritocracy. I pulled myself up. I worked really hard. I got paid more than the minimum wage. It's like, if you think about people who work, say, fast food, you're on your feet all the time, right? I was always told if you have time to lean, you have time to clean. Mm-hmm. So they constantly had you moving. Very few rest breaks. And if you're working in the kitchen, it is a hot, humid place to be. And if you accidentally touch a fryer, your finger is messed up for weeks. It is. These are harsh working conditions. These are people working pretty fast. They have time constraints they have to meet, and it's not like they're lazy. It's not that they're not hardworking. It is people don't value the work they're doing. Their bosses, their executives don't value them.
You hit the nail on the head with that one. Do not value that, and it's awful. All right. So you've been researching all this stuff. You teach it and whatnot. Does the quote unquote Great Resignation surprise you at all?
No, not even close. And the hesitation to come back into the workforce. In fact, I was talking about this with my students this past week. You'll see these job signs advertising $12 to $14 an hour all over town, trying to encourage people to come back and work for them. And there are some serious hesitations because, one, you have the pandemic hesitation, right? If a person is unable or unwilling to get vaccinated and they get the disease, they can be hospitalized. And if you don't work full time, you don't have health insurance. So that is super costly. And then some of these advertisements are actually kind of misleading. And what they're saying is that if you work for us for long enough and you train through all these things, you might be able to earn $12 to $14 in the future. But we're going to start you off at $7, $8 an hour to train up. And so you have that kind of hesitation. And then the expanded unemployment benefits. It just became better for a person they earn better benefits and by not working than they do by working.
Now, with the benefit, true, but when the benefits ended, there was just a report that came out today that I read. The benefits have been gone for a while, and people still aren't going to those jobs. What do you think causes that? The hesitation, or maybe they felt betrayed?
Perhaps. It also depends on if they get full-time work. The fact that health insurance is tied to full-time work is a huge barrier for people. It would be alleviated if we had something like universal health care, where it doesn't matter where you work, right? You can go to the doctor. Whereas people might still be waiting to go back into the workforce until they can find a full-time job. They're not going to accept part-time work because they cannot afford health insurance under it. I think that's a huge barrier to it.
I think also too, and in my experience, there's a lot of people who do work full-time and, some of these restaurants and whatnot, and the insurance is so overpriced, they can't take the hit on the paycheck.
That's right. Yeah. Americans pay more for health care per person than just about every other developed nation in the world. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it's still privatized is kind of shocking. I don't agree with everything Bernie Sanders says, but the part about universal health care and it being cheaper, that's proven to be true. That's unequivocal.
Yeah. We had a discussion one time with Irish Connection about, their health benefits versus ours. And, to some extent, I think he would agree. He was just shocked at what we're dealing with.
Right.
Yep.
And you deal with a lot of, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go on.
Oh, I was going to say, there's a lot of misinformation, right? They talk about, all this socialized medicine up in Canada. People were waiting months to get surgery. There are longer waits for elective surgeries, but if you needed open heart surgery, you still go to the ER and you still get served. Like, that still happens. I could be wrong about this, Irish, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Like,
yes, I think I said it at the time as well. See, I think that it might even warrant its own episode. That healthcare within not just retail, I suppose, but any low paid job in the United States, it is ridiculous. Nick, you're absolutely correct. Per capita, you spend. It's one of the most inefficient models I've ever seen. Yeah. You spend absolutely crazy amounts of money, and you do not get value for it. And just like, actually, on that topic, go back to value. Like, price is what you pay, value is what you get. Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of the jobs market at the moment, globally, but in particular in the States, there seems to be a disconnect with in particular the bigger employers. They don't get it that there's been a shift in the market here. You need to pay more, because if you do not pay more, the value of what you have, you're going to lose good employees, or you're going to get people that don't care about working for you. That's a big thing. I think that they for me, they don't seem to understand that what we call it, the Great Resignation or whatever it is. It's a fundamental shift in the market.
Yeah, there are positions that just aren't going to come back. If you've ever walked into a Walmart or a grocery store, you notice now that at least half of the registers are closed, and it's now become all self-checkout. So there's a situation where if the technology becomes close enough to be cost-effective to replace an employee, they're going to do it, because the machine never has to go on vacation, and the machine is
or
never
on
going to
strike.
take maternity leave. Yeah, that's exactly right. John Deere's dealing with that right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
The funny thing about self-checkouts is we did an entire episode on it. I think the core comes down to the people that complain about it are your typical rude customers. They're just mad they can't yell at a machine.
Yeah. And they're on camera when they do it, typically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if you seen in the UK, Tesco opened its first store that has no checkouts at all, just the last couple of days.
Huh.
Not even self-checkouts. It's one of those, I think it's modeled on something Amazon was thinking about. It has high-tech cameras, and it just monitors what you take off a shelf and so on. I mean, automation is definitely killing jobs. And that's, I see where that is going. But, I think they're investing all of the profits that they get into things to replace employees, and we're missing the people. We're missing the value in people, like largely. And I think corporations they just keep chasing the bottom line. They don't actually think about their workforce and the wider effect it has in the economy. You're an economist, you know this much, that the lower wage workers spend more of their money in the economy. Yeah. That's what if you raise the minimum wage, it will stimulate it, in my opinion.
Yeah. I give this example to my students all the time. I ask them, what would you do if I gave you $20? And I get answers like, I'd go buy groceries with it. I'd go buy food with it. I might go shopping at the mall with it. Right. And then I ask them, what if you gave Donald Trump $20? Well, they give me answers like, he'd sit and invest on it, or he'd wipe his ass with it. I mean, just, typical responses. But that's what holds up, right? The very low income, they spend an incredibly high proportion of their income on goods and services. They're spending it on rent. They're buying groceries. They're spending it on utility bills, cell phone bills, cable bills. They have all these different needs that are trying to be met, and they have to meet them. And so their paycheck is going to go to do that. Whereas if you gave it to a Warren Buffett doesn't need $20. If he saw it on the ground, he probably wouldn't even bend over to pick it up. It would just, like, they don't need all these extra tax breaks. And so the trickle down economic theory, right? If the rich get taxed because they'll create more jobs, so it trickles down to us. Like, it makes sense if you don't think about it. Like,
very well put.
The rich have no incentive to share their wealth.
Now, when you gave the history of minimum wage, you made the comment about the talk around a minimum wage so you could afford rent and you could afford to live. At what point in time do you think that thought process just disappeared? Because obviously when the minimum wage was enacted, it was actually enacted to help with those things. And now it's like, minimum wage, like you said, it's like, oh, it's for teenagers, or it's for this, or it's for that. But the original core concept was for people to be able to live off of it.
Yeah, it's designed to be a living wage. It says it right in the Fair Labor Standards Act itself, right? It's designed to allow you to live where you work. And I think really it's kind of like this argument that trickles through from corporations to people who don't think through what they're saying. And so it becomes this argument because you do see a lot of teenagers working at it. You do see a lot of people who maybe don't have high school diplomas working for the minimum wage. And it's this low skill, low wage argument. Well, if you or I were to start up working at McDonald's, we would be the low person on the totem pole, regardless of our college education or previous work experience. The people who have been working there longer are simply better skilled at those jobs than we are. So that doesn't hold a lot of water, right? People train, they learn to do things a lot better, and they should be compensated for it, even if it's something that most people are capable of doing.
Correct. What you got, Irish?
I'm curious. Do you think that talking about the minimum wage, we get tied up in a kind of arbitrary number, like, say $15 an hour too much? Because obviously there's so many variables. Like $15 an hour in working in a cafe in Manhattan is criminal. However, in other parts of the country, it may actually be more toward the livable wage.
Yep. Yeah. So if I were to fix the minimum wage, right, I guess like if I were some all-powerful presidential type and I were establishing a minimum wage, I would want to have cost of living ties to it. So it would be like geographically different, even within states, right? Because if you're living in Manhattan, your rent is going to be much, much higher than if you're living on Staten Island, and certainly higher than if you're living in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so you would have these kind of geographical differences. So if corporations really wanted to take advantage of low wages, they would have to move to rural or otherwise low-income areas. So you would see geographical differences. There has to be some sort of component there. But it needs to be tied to rent. Rent is usually 100%. The number one or number two cost for everybody.
Yeah, the one thing that everybody needs the most is the damn hardest to get, and that's a place to live.
Yeah.
What you got, Irish?
Well, I suppose I'd like to know your opinion. In over here in Ireland, we do have a minimum wage. It equates to about somewhere between $11 and $12 an hour, and like I just said, the cost of living varies wildly depending on where you're living.
Sure.
But what some, in particular, retailers have done to kind of avoid paying the minimum wage is actually promote people and pay them a salary and then double their hours. And this is sort of a by proxy way of paying people less. And I, by the way, was one of them. And I, at the time, and Steve knows this, I bought into that bullshit Kool-Aid retail crap of like, it'll be a great opportunity to do this. And effectively, what I was doing was I was getting paid per hour less than some of the people that I was supervising. I'd just like to know your opinion on that.
Yeah. So salaried workers, right? There isn't an hourly component tied to it. So if you work extra hours to get your job done, you don't receive any extra compensation for it. Like I, as a teacher, I have a bunch of papers in one of my classes. I have to work on weekends to get them done, but I'm not going to receive any extra pay for it. It's just work that has to get done. So it is a very interesting scheme around it. But I'm surprised that if you have trackable hours and you work longer than the typical 40-hour work week, that you wouldn't be able to have any sort of recourse against it. That's a little bit interesting.
Well, I remember back when I think it was Obama, and it got shot down, obviously, when the administration changed. But one of the last things he had enacted was going to be this sort of mandate that if you were a salaried employee, you had to make X amount of money, or any hour over, I believe, 45 hours, you were supposed to get like an overtime rate. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Yeah. I've also remember changing the work week from 40 hours to 35, right? Essentially kind of lowering the bar for who qualifies as being a full-time worker. Yeah, that would be great. You have to track it for positions, and it's tough in places like teaching where, like, for example, I teach 5 classes. 2 of them are online and 3 of them are face-to-face. And so my hourly time in the classroom itself might be like 10, 12 hours, right? But I'm clearly doing preps and grading and doing all these other tasks that are part of the job. And if I do it efficiently, should I still be compensated beyond that work? So it's tough to measure with those salary positions because there isn't always an output component to it. Like it's a lot more complicated than I think we're giving it credit for. But yeah, in a perfect world, yeah, you would be compensated for 40 hours, and any hour worked above it, you'd get extra pay. But
yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're doing work, get paid for it.
Yeah.
What you got, Irish?
Well, I suppose just going back to the academic side of things, do you know of any sort of academic studies on minimum wage workers that say, do they suffer from things like depression or drug dependency or lifespan, all that sort of stuff? Is there any studies that you're aware of that kind of highlights the correlation between minimum wage workers and their kind of life outcomes?
I haven't read any studies on the minimum wage and health outcomes, right? I mean, we could talk through on why it would have an adverse selection on their health, right? Because a lot of minimum wage workers don't work one job. They work 2 or 3, right? So they're, instead of putting in 40 hours a week, they're putting in closer to 80, right? Just to make ends meet. And so that kind of additional stress weighs on them. There's the financial stress they would be under. And then, of course, the type of food they're going to typically buy, right? Like if you're a minimum wage worker and you go out to eat, you're probably not going to eat at like big fancy steakhouses. You're more likely to eat fast food, right? And so your intake of things like saturated fats is going to be higher. But I would have to look for some longitudinal studies. I can't say for certain that it is one way or the other.
Hero had a question in the chat. What if there were a maximum amount of rent, maybe based on population density, made in proportion to the average salary in an area? Do you think that would make them rethink minimum wage in an impactful manner?
Well, rent controls in certain areas of the country, like New York City, kind of exist. But New York City and San Francisco and Seattle are a little more progressive in raising their minimum wages anyway. It would, if the minimum wage in your area were tied to rent, like if you had these geographical differences, you would definitely see rents change in certain areas, right? You wouldn't see the astronomical rents in San Francisco that you do because people couldn't afford to live there or bus in, and then they would start losing jobs to rural areas or otherwise low-income neighborhoods. So it would be interesting to see if there's any leveling out. because there are other amenities to living in San Francisco that you wouldn't have in rural areas like Nebraska.
Right.
So there's issues there. But yeah, having a rent component tied to your wages for your area would be hugely beneficial, I think.
So as an economist, what is your take on cost of living? And what I mean by that is, how much of it do you think is inflated just from a profit standpoint? Because you hear a lot of people, the same people that are complaining about if the minimum wage gets raised, they're going to be paying, more for merchandise. They never were like stomping on the steps of the Capitol raising Cain anytime there was a huge cost of living increase. They just kind of took it, it was like, okay, well, whatever. But yeah. Why do you think people keep tying the minimum wage into cost of living, which in my opinion doesn't really factor into it as much as people like to make it seem?
Yeah, it's that argument, right? It's not coming from them. They're not the ones coming up with it. It is a corporate ideal that if we can convince a large enough section of the population that raising the minimum wage is going to be bad for them, then we can have a big voting block against it. And what it is, it's people who kind of work for like $15 to $20 an hour. They wouldn't see any benefit for other people getting that additional wage. Like, they don't think they would get a pay adjustment to match any sort of cost of living adjustment that would happen. Like, prices would rise. Like, I swear there have been studies about this for like McDonald's and what the typical cost of a meal would happen if the minimum wage were to go from $7.25 to $15 an hour, and it'd go up like 10, 11%. It's not double like what people seem to think it would be. It's pretty marginal when you think about it. I mean, it's a pretty small impact.
What you got, Irish?
Well, just on that exact point, I mean, obviously you've heard of the Big Mac index. So I mean, like, I think I know for a fact Washington D.C. and Oregon pay like $15 an hour minimum wage, I think, but the cost of a Big Mac is not double what you would pay in a state that pays $7.25.
That's exactly right.
Pretty much as simple as that. I would just like to know your opinion on, the value that employers get from their employees, like in terms of their productivity and stuff like that. There seems to be corporate, in particular in the bigger institutions, the corporate policies. We pay this wage in this state. That's it. There's no negotiation. And I think there's a power imbalance there, because a lot of employees are worth more, as you pointed out before, like ones that have worked there for years, that may not be entry-level first job kind of employees. But I think now it's beginning to change because of this great, resignation kind of thing. Do you think that the power that employers had for a long, long time is beginning to change in terms of what the employee can expect in their worth?
Yeah, this is interesting, right? It's how far away really is the employer from the employee, right? With large corporations, your Walmarts, your Amazons, Jeff Bezos isn't shaking hands with a warehouse worker, right? The Waltons are never rubbing elbows with people doing the checkout. And so there's this disconnect because they don't actually see these employees, right? These are just essentially numbers, names on pay stubs. And so there's a bit of a missing human connection to it. They don't kind of care. They do PR stunts, right? They hire veterans or they hire disabled workers to make their company seem like they're trying to do the good thing. And so there are just all these kind of stunts to really skirt the issue, which is, how are we treating people who are working for us? And when employees feel like they're respected and they feel like they have their voices heard, they go out and perform better because they feel like the company wants them just as much as they want to hold that job. But if you treat people like crap, they will give you crappy attitude and crappy work. So there's a real big disconnect there. Like, it's all about how you treat people. It's not necessarily how you pay people even. Pay helps for sure. Yeah.
Continue, Irish.
Okay, I'll ask you a rhetorical question. What do you think is more broken, the labor market or the people who work in it?
That's a good
one. The market
one.
itself works. Yeah, that's pretty good. The market works, right? Jobs are available. People can choose to enter those jobs. It is people rediscovering their self-worth, right? When they were taken care of a bit by the government, they can understand that, like, maybe it isn't worth going to work for $9 an hour anymore. Right? Maybe I am worth more than what my employer thinks I am. And so this is kind of an interesting shift in history, I think. It could be a big win for the labor movement. We'll see how it pans out, because the strains are running at each other. We'll see who wins.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but and I could be wrong here. In your military, there's a thing called hazard pay or something along those lines, where depending on where you are, you get paid differently. Is that correct?
Yeah,
well, I would extend that to like the likes of, in particular during a pandemic in retail. There were some companies that did pay, I suppose, what you would call the equivalent to hazard pay, but that was there before. Yes, perhaps COVID was not there before, but being exposed to the general public, who are liable to do almost anything to a minimum wage employee, deserves something more than minimum wage, in my opinion.
Yeah. Retail employees, fast food employees most employees do not get paid to deal with some of the people who walk into their restaurants and their stores. I remember working fast food, and I had this lady blow up at me for like cleaning her table or something. Like, it was like something nonsensical. And she got mad at me for like doing my job. And I'm getting paid, I think, $7.50 an hour. Like, garbage.
Yep.
Like,
you're not paid for that.
That's exactly like, I never got training on how to deal with angry customers. I just got trained on how to clean tables and take orders. Like,
yeah, I mean, sorry, Steve. Just on that, I once got a customer complain to me that there was a fly in the room, and that it needed to be removed. It was a job I did not hold for very long. I was a bartender for a while, and the customer complained that, like, oh, there's a fly annoying me. What do you want me to do? Like,
you're hired to be a bartender, not pest control.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I have an interesting one for you, Nick. One of our Warzone core members had a prediction a while back, and he wanted me to ask you about it. He said he was wondering what you would think of his prediction that if wages go up, customer service employers could move to a quote-unquote gig economy model where everyone is a quote-unquote independent contractor.
Ooh,
that's a good one.
Yeah. The gig economy is pretty strange because they're trying to skirt employment laws, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. And so states are kind of cracking down on it, right? They're starting to crack down on things like Uber and Lyft and forcing them to treat employees like employees. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's really all about benefits. Can you work full-time, receive benefits from this job? Because if you can't, you're never going to want to work that position, ideally, right? Unless you absolutely have to. And then you end up working 2 jobs or 3 jobs. And I don't know that customer service would just go to a gig economy. I don't know who would voluntarily sign up to be like a busboy or to take orders if they couldn't get regular hours doing it.
I agree with you there. I think more of the concept, would be businesses getting desperate, to not provide benefits and, at least try it just to see if they can get away with it. Because unfortunately, you got a lot of desperate people out there that'll take any kind of work they can find.
Yeah.
And, if Walmart was to do that, it's over for everybody.
Yeah, there are a lot of desperate people out there, but there also are kind of like minimum needs that need to be met. And so that's, again, part of the reason that people just haven't gotten fully back into the workforce yet. It's like, is this going to pay me enough to make me leave my house? And so they could risk it, but they'd also risk like not having work, like not having the workers come. I don't know if it's worth that gamble, but yeah.
Somebody will. There's a lot of foolish retailers out there. It would not surprise me to see somebody attempt that. It'll probably fail, immensely, but I can see somebody trying, especially like the dollar stores. Because I was a manager for a Dollar Tree for a very long time. And, you make a really good point about, long-term employees that, they've been there longer or whatnot. And, I talk about an employee that I had that, he was 50-something years old or whatnot. He was never going to carry a set of keys. He was never going to get promoted. But he was one of the best damn employees I had. He always showed up. If I needed somebody, he was there. He was clutch all the time. And I just feel like, there's value to that. And they deserve to get paid better than $7.35 an hour.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about how you treat people, right? There are people who work for pretty low pay. I mean, teachers among them, right? But if there's respect in the school district, they stay with the school district, even if it doesn't pay as well as some of these better ones or bigger, better pay.
You're right, because that's something I've dabbled in wanting to do an episode on is teachers, because, all right, the pay is obviously, it could be a lot better. But, when you're looking locally or you're looking at like, any kind of teacher, the amount of money that the teacher has to put out themselves for supplies and all those things, and, and all the parents.
We're talking hundreds, possibly thousands a year,
yeah.
Right? And you know what the tax write-off is for it?
What?
$250.
Jesus Christ.
That's it. Think about an elementary school teacher, all the money they spend on like Kleenex boxes. You remember when you were a kid, you had a list of things you had to bring the first day, right? They go through those by like February. So the last 3 months is all out of the teacher's salary. All the bulletin boards you would see that had decorations and, their little cubbies and whatever, all comes out of the teacher's salary. Like all the classroom setup comes from teacher salaries. And like, I don't think people realize how much extra money that especially in K-12, the teachers put in to do their jobs and to do it effectively.
I've always been a proponent of, I feel like that teachers should be paid like pro athletes, because, teachers are such a fundamental foundation for all children, and you're not only are you tasked, like you said, going through K-12 or whatnot, especially, in the early grades, not only are you tasked with educating children, you're also tasked with caring for them, and God, you guys need a lot more money. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah.
Elementary school teachers, man, especially if they teach like kindergarten, like the first year that those students are in, it's like herding cats, right? Because the student just isn't aware on all the functions that a school goes through, all the standing in line and all the timing that has to happen for it. And holy cow, I mean, and the attitudes you could get from these kids. You'll never get the same kid 2 days in a row. So like, and they spend 7 hours a day with them, like almost like their own kids, like there's a huge connection there.
I'll go on record saying that it is blatantly obvious that educators got completely screwed during the pandemic.
I mean, listen, I'm very fortunate to have kept my job during the pandemic. I ended up working remotely, doing a lot of these Zoom meetings and Skype meetings to try to do it. And, that connection with students just wasn't there, right? Like I wouldn't see them outside of class ever. And a lot of them, they would just put up black screens and they would chime in. A couple of them would chime in, but most of it was just a lot of dead air, like it was really tough for educators. And then you have all this pushback now on like mask mandates, and just, they are not paid to deal with this crap.
No. And that's something too that we've brought up, even in the retail sector, as far as mandates go. Like you said, when you got yelled at, for cleaning a table, you've got these people out there working, for really low wages, doing a job, and you're expecting them to police a mandate. Fine. If you got a mandate to police, go hire you some damn security, or start paying the people to police it,
Right. It's a little more flexible in the private arena. Private retail stores can make their own policies, right? You can see store policies even outside of places like Walmart, where they say, according to CDC guidelines, masks are recommended in the store, and they can place them out there. But if it's not being enforced, then it's really not much of a mandate. In the public sector, everything kind of has to go through this bureaucratic system because these are state employees. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of pushback on it here in Wyoming, because Wyoming's a very conservative, kind of libertarian. You do things on your own. And so they kind of like, don't tell me what to do is the big attitude. And so a lot of parents like really disagreed with having any sort of mask mandate for students, even though they saw flu rates drop and they saw student attendance rates go up when students were wearing masks. They were still just like livid that teachers would recommend what the CDC recommends.
Yep.
It's mind-boggling. Yeah. All
right. So we're just about at an hour. Irish, you get the last go around.
Okay. I'd just like to ask Nick, thank you so much, first of all, for coming on today. I reached out to a lot of academics, and you were one of the few that actually came back. So props to you for that. But I would like to ask, from an academic point of view, to wrap this up, do you plan in the future to do any sort of, what research are you going to do on the minimum wage, or, subjects of interest you have? That's what I'd like to know.
Yeah, so I don't do a lot of research on the minimum wage. One thing I'm working on right now is it's more just for the state economy as a whole, is looking at tax rates and tax growth. So Wyoming is a fortunate state because it's blessed with a lot of natural resources. So we have no state income tax and no state corporate income tax. And so I was looking at how do tax rates affect GDP growth over time? And why hasn't Wyoming, with these incredibly low taxes, grown over time? And then comparing it to the type of economy the state has, and just looking at ways that Wyoming needs to adapt. So I'm working on a kind of a more macro level. I don't do a lot of research with the minimum wage. I just been asked to do interviews, so I do research on it. What are some laws surrounding it? And then just doing some kind of back of the envelope calculations on really, can you live off the minimum wage anymore? And the answer is clear that one job isn't going to do it.
Nope.
Thank you.
All righty, Nick. I really do appreciate you coming on. This was a very informative conversation. We touch on these topics a lot, but Irish was correct in having somebody, who is truly, an economist, to kind of speak on these things. It gives a lot of validity, to, the argument, so to speak. So, once again, I absolutely appreciate your time. Thank you for, following through or whatnot. And, do you have any last words?
Minimum wage has to go up at some point, and I hope it goes up soon.
Same. All right, my friend, it has been a great evening, everybody. Thanks for watching. I know, it was a Friday night. We don't do this often, but This is something that we believe in and we felt like we needed to do. Next Wednesday, we'll be talking with Mr. Petrovelli about his retail comic book. So that's coming up. I'm going to take a nice little breather this weekend after the fiasco of the last few days. So everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, guys. Thanks for having me on.